Welcome. Thank you all for coming out on this cold night. This is the 14th of the Open the Eyes of Our Heart Forum on Issues of Justice and Peace. So some of you I know have been here before, and if this is your first time, thank you for joining us. Tonight's topic, a historical perspective on understanding the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is timely and emotionally charged. We're here tonight not to support one side or the other, but to help us all understand how we got to where we are today. We know that each of you will have your own views on this topic, but we ask you to remember to respect the views of others who may not share your perspective. Two speakers tonight come from our own parish family. Ed Hobbs is a retired naval flight officer who spent time in the Middle East and has read extensively about this area. He also was a high school world history teacher. Joe Burke is a retired Air Force colonel and a professor of international relations at the U.S. Air Force Academy. He has a PhD in national security studies in the Middle East. At the Academy, he taught Middle East politics and was the chair of the Middle East Studies Group. He has traveled extensively in Israel and the Middle East. As with all forums, we'll have the speakers speak, and then we'll have a Q&A, and we'll have wine and cheese afterwards. So if you want to talk to the speakers after, they'll be also with the wine and cheese. Father Dan, could you open us with a prayer?
Before I start the prayer, I would like all of us to give the applause for Joe and Ed Hobbs. When they came to share with me and they said, Father, what is your recommendation? I said, for this topic, let us share ourselves, because Ascension is a family. And because it's a family, we have people with all the talents and everything. So let us make use of those treasures God has given us. And that's why we ask our brothers to come forward and help us for today. Thank you for that. So before I start with the prayer, I want to share the words from Pope Francis last year in November. He started by saying that we all feel the pain of the wars. Since the Second World War ended until today, wars have followed in many parts of the world. He said, when they are far away from us, we do not feel them as much. Today, they are too very near that force us to react. Ukraine and the Holy Land. The Pope expressed his sorrow for the suffering caused by war. What is happening in the Holy Land is very painful. It is very painful, he said. Pope Francis went on to assert that the Palestinian people and the people of Israel have the right to peace. These two fraternal peoples have the right to live in peace, he added. He then invited everyone to pray for peace in the Holy Land and for dialogue to prevail. Let us pray for peace in the Holy Land, he said. Let us pray that the difficulties resolve themselves in dialogue and negotiation, and not with a mountain of dead on each side. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, to guide us, to strengthen us, and to bring us together. Give us strength to recognize that you are always present in our journey of life. We put our brothers and sisters in the Holy Land so that, God, you may continue to bring them together as brothers and sisters, especially to bring peace and love to one another. And for us who are sitting here to discuss for the well-being, we are gathered in one mission: to pray for peace and to bring peace not only for this country, but for the whole world. And we ask thee through Christ our Lord.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out here. It's great to have everyone out here on this very important, there we go. Is it good? Can you hear me now? Okay. All right. Well, good evening, and thanks for coming out here on this evening. It's a very important topic, and I'm just going to set the stage briefly for what we're going to do here this evening. So our purpose here is not to make you all experts on this subject. You know, even if we wanted to, 90 minutes is not nearly enough time to do that. So our goal here today is to gain a better awareness of how history, geography, competing backgrounds, and different regional perspectives affect the current crisis between Israel, Hamas, and the Palestinian people. We will also provide you with a list of books, articles, websites, and videos that you can use for further study on this very complicated topic. We won't attempt to provide answers or solutions to this crisis. You know, that's been going on for 2,000 years. I don't think Joe and I will be able to do that today. We're not going to argue any particular point of view. We are not experts on this subject, but we think we have enough of a background to provide you with enough information to give you some general knowledge of the subject and to lead you on to some further studies if you desire. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joe.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Joe Burke, for those of you that don't know me. And Ed and I have become experts in this field in the last 3 days. Actually, I taught Middle East politics, but it's been 25 years ago, and I did need to do a lot of catching up. In the fall, when Father Dan asked us to develop and present this forum, we searched the internet and the academic literature to find articles and videos that did three things. They were comprehensive, they were concise, and they were objective. And tonight, at the end of our presentation, as Ed has said, we're going to distribute to you a page worth of these kinds of things that you can go to if you want to research more about this topic. Now, we've been watching this topic as just general citizens of a country that is trying to negotiate peace in that region for a long time. And the media plays it almost every night, and as Father has said, and as Ed has said, there are many different opinions here. I just talked to someone who came in to listen to this, and I said, well, what do you think? And she said, well, I keep hearing all these great arguments on one side, and then I think I'm on that side. And then one of my other friends brings me all these great arguments on the other side, and I say, well, I'm on this side. So we go back and forth. Well, what we're going to try to do tonight is we have selected 2 videos that we're going to show you portions of each, which is going to be the history of the region. Now, we're going to ask you to hold on to your seats and listen carefully, because we're not talking way back to biblical times. We only have an hour and a half. We're talking more in the more recent time since the establishment of the State of Israel. But even in that 75 years, there's a lot that has happened in that part of the world. And we hope these 2 videos will set the stage for some discussion that we might have. We'll go on from there and we'll talk about perspectives, and then we'll pass out the information if you want further study. So, in view of the time limitations, we were looking for 2 videos that did 2 things. They were reasonably short and condensed, and they capture the major issues and events of these critical years. We came across these 2 good summaries. The first one was done by the Council on Foreign Relations, which is noted for its objective reporting on U.S. foreign policy in the world. It was produced in 2023, and it can be found on YouTube. The total video is only 14 minutes long, but we have edited out the opening introduction that was general discussion on the work of the council in order to get right to the point. According to the video is a multimedia guide, part of a multimedia guide that offers a look at the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And according to the introduction, it offers no attempt to steer the audience to a certain solution. It just lays out the facts and grievances in a digestible way. It's meant to serve as a teaching aid for educators, part of a 13-part series that educators can use in their courses in the United States. So for that in mind, I'm going to ask Ed to run the first video, and then we'll quickly introduce the second one after that. Thank you, Ed. Well, that's a lot to absorb in a short period of time. And did you want to say something, Ed? What I wanted to do is give you my perspective of what I have just seen after teaching Middle East politics for almost 20 years, although the last time I taught it was almost 25 years ago. But I came up with 7 things we should think about when we evaluate what's happening in Israel today. The first one, perspectives. It's very important to have facts and other details about what actually happened. But when one deals in the Middle East, or in this particular crisis, and you're looking for ways to resolve the crisis, I don't think facts are the most important. What is important is understanding the perspectives of the various actors. Someone said before we started today, it seems like there's 2 rights and 2 wrongs. That's a way to start thinking about this perspective, this crisis. Let me give you an example. Before I do that, let me just give you a caveat about perspectives. Now, when I talk about a Palestinian perspective, an Israeli perspective, think about this. Is there an American perspective? Not really. I mean, if you look at what we're facing in terms of political issues and things coming up as the election starts heating up, you can't talk about a single American perspective. We are a divided country in many ways. And that's for every group. But when I talk about a perspective, it means almost 50 or higher percentage of those people tend to hold that. So let's take the Israeli perspective. The Israeli perspective is over hundreds and thousands of years, we have been around the world, isolated, discriminated against, in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. My wife Diane and I were in Budapest just a couple months ago, and we went to the Israeli synagogue, or the Jewish synagogue in Budapest, and they talked about 50,000 Jews who were killed by the Nazis in the Holocaust. So when you look at the Israeli perspective of this, you have to think they come from a long history of persecution. Now, if you go to the Palestinian perspective, what they say is, we're not Western Europe. Why are we being penalized for what Europeans did to the Jews in all these centuries? Do you see that difference of perspective? That shows you this is not an easy dilemma that both countries or all countries are trying to face. So perspective is the first point that I would like you to get. Now, The second one I'd like to put out there is the impact of refugee status. In 1948, 500,000 Palestinians were moved to different refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. 500,000 people. That was 75 years ago. Even today, they are in a refugee status in these various countries. Whole generations have come and gone under those 75 years. And what has that done to the Palestinian perspective? It has radicalized a large segment of their population because of what? There is no hope for better families, for better living status. They are a people without hope unless something can help them reach out. Now let's take the Israeli perspective. They also come from, and this is the third one, from persecution around the world. And over the course since 1948, 3 million Jewish immigrants have come into this territory. And these, in the more recent time, media and academics have told us, the fastest growing religion in Israel today is a fundamentalist brand of Judaism. These people are coming home and they want a country that it's kind of like the American dream, where they can not worry about anti-Semitism, they can be treated as equals, they can profess their religion, and they can be close to the religious locations that are part of their religion in the Old Testament as we know it as Christians. Difference, that's the third one. So that's a third theme. The fourth one, and what does that do to the Israelis? My perspective, and in my visits with Israel, and I visited both the IDF, their defense people, a couple occasions as a representative of the U.S. Air Force, but I also went over there one time as a professor on Professors for Peace in the Middle East, and I got a chance to see a lot of that country. The Israelis are very hard line when you come to start talking about the security of Israel. They do not mess around when you talk about security of Israel. Well, you can understand that when you know where they've come from and where they are now, and the fact there's been, which will be my next point, there's been 4 major attacks and wars with Israel since 1948. The day after they declared their country, they were attacked on all sides by Arab countries. And since that time, there's been 3 other conflicts. Now, there's also been 2 major, what's called intifadas, Intifada 1 and 2, and that's where the Palestinians, out of results of lack of hope, being not treated equally, rose up. And so they've had a divisiveness and a disturbance within the society. It all treats, as I've talked to both sides, they're going this way. In many ways, it's like the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, but I'm on a much more intense scale. Please don't tell everybody I'm equating our Democrats and Republicans to Israelis and Hamas. But you can see, without hope and with frustration, you move toward extremes on both sides. So the Israelis have not been hesitant to remove civil rights if they feel it's in the national security of their country. The Palestinians have experienced that, and that's what causes them to be frustrated. Point number 4. The next one I'd like to bring out is that this migration has resulted in both sides being frustrated. And so, the continuous war, I've talked about that. Now, the next point I'd like to make is the centrality of religion in this conflict. How many here have been to the Holy Land and have seen Jerusalem? Could you raise your hand? So that's about maybe a quarter of you. If you go to Jerusalem, and you can't quite capture it right here, but there's a Jewish Wailing Wall is a wall that is the old temple in Jerusalem. Right at the top of that wall is the Arab or the Islamic mosque, which is a very key, as you can see it here. And then 2 blocks down the street is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where we Christians believe Jesus Christ was crucified. Now, you've got 3 major religions tied in to a 2-block area of Jerusalem. So the question is, who is in charge if we ever do a two-state solution? Who gets Jerusalem? And it's not only, the religion part not only goes to Jerusalem, but all those 3 million Jews that are coming back into Israel are coming, for many of them, particularly the more recent immigrants to the country. They're there because they're very intense Jewish people. And they want access to the sites of the Old Testament. Where is the biggest sites besides Jerusalem? It's in the West Bank. It's in a Palestinian area. And so where did the settlers want to settle, these Jewish settlers that came in starting in 1948? They want to settle in places close to their holy sites, which are in, the UN said you're not supposed to be there. Jews went in there and settled there because that was close to their religion. And that has complicated these settlements, and refugees have really complicated what's happening in the world today between Israel and Hamas. I could also go and make another point that Hamas, if you caught this in the presentations, Hamas was elected by the people of Gaza. And they run all the metropolitan services in Gaza. They are the government of Gaza. Hamas, a terrorist group. Now, those of you that might have had military experience, and I talked to a few of you beforehand on how to deal with terrorists, one of the first things you want to do is isolate the terrorists from the population. That ain't happening in Gaza because they're integrated in it, and not only integrated in it, they built tunnels under hospitals and tunnels under buildings. From a military perspective, and I could ask many of you military people here in the audience, or former military people, that is one heck of a difficult military challenge on how to deal with that. Another point that I hope this history has brought you to understand. There's 2 more really quickly I wanted to say. One is how regional and international politics have integrated and influenced this. And we're going to talk about that. In fact, Ed's going to talk about that when we get to perspectives in this situation. And that's a key one when we look at the history. And the final one, which academics and all kinds of diplomats are looking at, is, okay, what if we had a 2-party solution? What's causing Israel not to want that right now? Well, the issue is they've watched the Palestinians form governments. In fact, there is no single Palestinian government. The Hamas controls the Gaza. There's a Palestinian Authority which controls the West Bank. Then you have a group in Lebanon called Hezbollah, which is another terrorist group. So the question that academics and Israelis ask is, would this be any better for the security of Israel if there was a Palestinian state? Or should we be involved in the control of this for our own security? Does everybody understand those issues, which makes this an extremely complicated situation to resolve? Well, I hope you've gotten some understanding of history. What we're going to do next is we're going to talk about perspectives. But before we talk about perspectives, we want to take a break and we want to ask you to take a deep breath, because we have just given you 75 years of intense history. And we're going to have some time to ask questions here, and then we'll go on to the perspectives and then pass out the information. How about, does anybody have any comments based on what you saw, something that you've been thinking about that Ed and I can answer? Are you stunned? Yeah.
I have one thing. I've been to Israel twice.
Oh, we got a mic here.
The thing that gets me is like when you said Israelis the thing that gets me,
It's
you
on.
say the Israelis they don't take prisoners when they get the toe stepped on, they're gonna cut your leg off. 1967, USS Liberty. President Johnson allowed Israel to go in there, attack the ship. They were about to come down and massacre everybody, but the carrier jets started coming, the Israelis saw it, and they left. Johnson called them back. And all those sailors that survived had to be dispersed all around the world, and we're not allowed to talk about it. And that's the way the Israelis are. You step on their toe, they're gonna take your leg. And there's no doing it. And I still can't wrap my head around. I know they thought we were gonna tell the Egyptian what was happening, but I still can't understand why we allowed that to happen.
In that particular case.
In that particular case, why we allowed the Israelis.
You know anything about that one, Ed?
Yes, I do know a little bit. The USS Liberty, hopefully everyone heard the question. It was a U.S. spy ship. It was off the coast of Egypt during the 1967 war when Israel was able to capture the West Bank, the Gaza, and Golan Heights from the Arab countries. It was a surprise attack by Israel. So there are some who feel that USS Liberty as a spy ship perhaps was there, and perhaps some information could get to the Egyptians, and the surprise attack would be discovered by the enemies of Israel. So there are some who feel that Israel deliberately attacked a U.S. ship, causing a lot of casualties. I don't know how many, but a lot of sailors were killed. So some think it was deliberate. There are others who say that it was an accident also. So there's two different perspectives. I'm not going to give you my opinion on that. You heard this gentleman's opinion.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's wrong at all, but there are other differing opinions on this subject.
We've got one question here, and we'll take another one over there. Yes, sir.
You know, the history of this region goes back thousands of years.
Right.
You know, before Christ. But since the Christian era, I wonder what population lived in that strip of land, Canaan, Palestine. We know that the Arabs were there, probably in greater numbers. I don't know, when did the Jewish people come into that area and use that as their homeland? Well, I wonder at what part in the history do they think that this is now their homeland?
I guess I'm not a biblical scholar, so I can't go back, but we can look at the history of our Bible, our Old Testament, and we can see how the Jews moved in at various times. I think it was after their exile in Egypt, and they came back. That's my rough understanding of it. But when they moved into these lands as Jews, there was a population there. And that population has been there all along. The Palestinians didn't move someplace else to suddenly become, but they didn't consider themselves a Palestinian up until the Pan-Arab movements in the 70s and 80s, when they started to think about this and started to name it Palestine. The Turks were in there, the Romans were in there, there's a whole series of empires. That area of the Mediterranean is such that anybody's in an empire building has to move around the water to get to wherever they're going. So it was traveled through on the part of a lot of different people, but the Palestinians were there, they lived there, they have generations there, and the Jews moved in sometime in the biblical era. Does that answer your question, Tom? I'm sorry I can't give you a year.
You know, that's another aspect.
That's another aspect.
That plays here as well.
It is.
It isn't just 75 years.
It really. We thought 75 years was almost too much for you to handle. We didn't want to go back to biblical times in today's discussion, but it's a very good point. Now could we pass that down that way? There's a question. How are we doing, Ed, for time? Good? Yeah, okay.
So you mentioned that the 500,000 Palestinians were dispersed into other Arab countries and have been there, a lot of them ever since. Did those Arab countries welcome them? Were they happy to be there? Did they say, come and join us and become an Egyptian? Or did they keep them separated from their own citizens and kind of
Want me to take that one?
continue
You want
to
to take
keep them as refugees?
The answer is no. So, for instance, let me give you Egypt. Egypt, the Arab regions around, although there is something called Pan-Arabism, that I had a colleague of mine who is one of the books, William Quant, I've recommended to you. He's one of the leading scholars on the area. So one time I asked him, I said, Bill, what is Pan-Arabism? And what he said was, Joe, Pan-Arabism is you talk about all your Arab brothers and you follow your national interest. And I thought that was a good definition of what I saw of Pan-Arabism. So what does that mean? That means that if you have a somewhat radicalized population, do you want them moving into your country? So Egypt has not necessarily welcomed Palestinians. Saudi Arabia, where I spent some time back and forth, Palestinians were working there, but they weren't integrated into the fabric of Saudi Arabia. They're there for short terms to return back to their homeland of Palestine. Jordan had that whole West Bank, what's called the West Bank, until the end of the '67 war. They treated that group separately than the Jordan, it was called Transjordan, but they were treated separately. And then Lebanon treated them separately. So the answer to your question is, Arabs talk a lot and defend Palestinians, but nobody's welcoming them with open arms, 1 million people into their own country, because it's an uncertain group of population. Would they still be then radicalized toward Israel and Egypt or Jordan or Syria? Does that answer your question? Thank you.
And I would say maybe the only exception to a minor degree would be Jordan, because Jordan already has an existing fairly large Palestinian population.
Yep.
And some of the Palestinians who fled into Jordan during the wars were given Jordanian citizenship. Not all of them, but some of them were. So Jordan is probably the exception to most of the rest of the countries in that region.
Good point, good point.
When was Israel called Israel? If it was always called Palestine, and we know from the Bible that Jews were going back to their homeland, Israel, but where was that? Because all you see is Palestine.
So the question, I'll just repeat the question. The question is, when was Palestinians called Palestinians, and when were Jews called Israelis? I would say in the Palestinian literature, when there was the Ottoman Empire occupied that whole area up until the early 19th century, they never named that area Palestine. It was named other provinces of the Ottoman Empire. And people didn't, my understanding as I talked to academics, didn't really feel that they started calling themselves Palestinians until sometime in the 1900s, when they started to identify themselves as a common people to themselves. On the Israeli side, the Zionist movement originated late in the 1800s, and I think in some of the Zionist literature, they were referring to the homeland of Israel at that point. Now, maybe there are some biblical references to that, but I don't know the answer to that. Ed, do you know any more about that? But I think it was relatively recent when you look at biblical times. These were all identified by city names or by tribes, but not by Israelis and Palestinians. Is that a...
So the land, the physical land,
Yeah.
the physical land was Palestine, and then they gave it to the Israelis, so it became Israel. So there was no Israel just in thought that you have your group of people?
Well, probably the first time they actually, when the British were leaving in the late 40s, and they turned to the UN and said, we can't handle this country. We've got people from both sides throwing bombs at us, Palestinians and Israelis. We want to turn this whole issue over to the United Nations. The United Nations proposed, at that point, a division of the country. And the West Bank still belonged to the Palestinians at that point, and Gaza at that point was belonging to Egypt. Now, the interesting part about the Egyptians in Gaza is the Israelis did take Gaza in the '67 war and offered to give it back to Egypt when they were doing their peace negotiations, when Egypt signed a peace treaty with it. And Egypt said, no thanks, we don't want Gaza back. Why wouldn't Egypt want Gaza back? There are 2 million Palestinians in there that are very angry, and they were, coming back to that one question, they're not sure they really wanted all of them as Egyptians, because it would stir up a whole new political movement in Egypt that they weren't excited to see. Maybe that's a little bit of Burke's interpretation, but that's what I get from the history. Any other comments you might have? Was this, before we go on to the perspectives and the objectives of the actors, was this somewhat enlightening to see this bigger picture? Yes, go ahead. Can you pass that? Yes.
There were 500,000 Palestinians that left the land of Israel during the 47-48 war, right? But how many Israelis were expelled from Iran, Iraq, Morocco at the same time?
How many Palestinians?
Israelis?
Israelis?
Or Jews, more than Jews were expelled
Well,
from North Africa.
I don't know the answer to that, but I know that 3 million Jews came back to Israel. Many of them were from Europe and those areas. But I don't know exactly how many came from those other Arab countries. I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to that.
Yeah, I know that that was happening in parallel, right? As Arabs were leaving, Arab countries were expelling Jews as well, but I don't know what that ratio.
That answer, I'll have to check on and get back to you. John, did you have a question?
To follow up on that, I did a little bit of review before I came here. Very little.
John's dangerous when he does research, okay.
But apparently Iraq was a place where there were a fair number of Jews living, and they were living in great peace and harmony until a change in leadership in Iraq, which caused them to start to be persecuted, and they started, pulling out and heading toward more of what we now call Israel.
When was that? When was that?
I think it said it was prior to World War I.
Yeah, I think it was in the 1800s.
Even under,
Israel become a state?
Israel declared its statehood in 1948, May 14th, and then the next day it was attacked on all sides by the several Arab countries, which did not want them to be a state. And they were grabbing land as it goes along. Ed, did you want to say something?
just going back to John's point, there were Jewish people in Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, all throughout that region prior to, mostly under the Ottoman Empire, which was in the 1800s to the early 1900s and before. There were Jews all throughout that region. And then as a result of the wars and of anti-Semitism, they were mostly expelled from those regions, and a lot of them settled in what is now Israel. Of course, a lot of them came here to the U.S.
Right.
Also, and some to Western Europe and other places.
Please.
Trying to understand who the Palestinian people are. As you said, there were many countries that came through there and had control over it at different times, and the influences they left behind. So, did the people that were there, through all of these changes, with other countries coming in and taking over, are these basically the same people who have descended, who we now refer to as Palestinians, so that they feel that they have been living here for generation after generation? Or is it a smorgasbord of people who just wound up in the area for like maybe over 200 years only, or something like that?
Ed, do you want to say anything?
I don't know completely the answer. I will say, though, that part of the reason why the Arabs lost the 1948 war was Israel was a very tight-knit, cohesive community that settled into that region. On the other side, the Arabs and what we now call the Palestinians were more of a clannish society. Their loyalty was not so much for the entire state there, but more towards their individual clan. So it was
Clans or
much
tribes?
loose tribe or clan. So it was a very loose-knit society compared to what Israel had. So as far as who the people were and where they come from, I don't really know the answer to that, but it wasn't as cohesive a society as the Israeli side.
So if they were clannish, if the Palestinians had control over themselves, would they then have a civil war among themselves because they would then go back to their clannish ways of which tribe is better than another tribe?
It's one of those possibilities that people don't know because we've never tried it out. I mean, if we have a Palestinian state, this two-state solution that people talk about, there's a lot of discussion and assumptions and hypotheses about what would this state look like. Would it be democratic? Would it be clannish? Would it be broken down into several? It's not that much territory we're talking about. But that's why when you turn to an Israeli and say, do you want a two-state solution, think of yourself. If you were an Israeli, would you want to create another country that has been somewhat radicalized right in your midst? So this is where you have to understand both of the perspectives. I'm not trying to avoid the question, but it is one we don't have an answer for at this particular point. And so it causes a lot of people to be hesitant. Does that help? Yeah. Should we go on to the?
Sure.
And then we'll open up for questions at the end when we talk about who's all playing in this game. That's what we'd like you to, because you thought history was complicated. Wait till you hear the next part. So, okay. So what I'm going to do is talk about Israel and Palestine, and Ed's going to take the regional powers and the superpower engagement. So let's talk about Israel first. What are the objectives of Israel in this conflict? I think it's very obvious if you're watching your TV every night what the number one objective of Israel is. Does anybody know? Destroy Hamas leadership and infrastructure. The leaders themselves, the people, and get in there and get the infrastructure, the tunnels, the weaponry, etc. Now, when I talk about this one, what sometimes I don't see enough of when I see the media is sometimes it looks like Israeli military are fighting unarmed civilians. That's not true. There's a lot of fighting. If ever you hear, when you hear these reporters in the background and they're in Gaza, there's a lot of machine gun fire going on behind them. There's two sides to this conflict. In fact, I read in the news last week, every day 25 missiles are shot from Gaza into Israel, various towns in Israel. Tom Stephan, who couldn't be here tonight, talked about a friend of his sent an email today that there were warnings coming up about missiles coming in from either Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas. So there's a war on, and war is not one side, it's two sides. So the number one objective of Israel is destroy Hamas. The second objective is protect the people, I think. The third objective is figure out how to get the hostages home. Now, just this week, we're seeing more rumors, if it ever can come to fruition, of there might be a ceasefire with all of the civilian hostages released. But as I hear that, I ask myself, what leverage does Hamas have over Israel today? And that, to me, keeps ringing the bell, hostages, hostages, hostages. So if Hamas ever gives the hostages back to Israel, what do you think might happen to Hamas? If the objective is to destroy the leadership and the infrastructure. So I'm glad I am not a U.S. diplomat or negotiator. That's one heck of a negotiation to be overseeing. The fourth one is make sure this never happens again. Now, Israel was caught with their pants down, basically. I always have great respect for Israeli intelligence, And somebody made a mistake. Even Netanyahu on one of the television programs said, somebody made a mistake. We don't have time to deal with that today, but we are going to deal with that soon. So they've got to clear that up, and they've got to create a security situation that 1,200 people will not be killed like that again in a terrorist attack. You can understand that from a U.S. perspective because we had a terrorist attack. And you can understand where the Israelis are coming from. And then the last one, I think from an Israeli perspective, is to create some sort of security arrangement in Gaza where they can pull the troops out. Israel activated 300,000 people for this war. That's 3% of their population. They cannot afford to keep 3% of their population fighting a war as a smaller country. They're not the United States. They're fairly small. They're big. They're a good country, but they're fairly small. And they're trying to figure out how do we keep things safe from Gaza, but how do we bring the troops home, basically. We would have the same situation here in the United States when we looked at our troops in the Middle East. That's their fifth one. That's what my opinion is, that's what Israel is looking to do here. So now when we turn to the Palestinians, it becomes very complicated. I'm going to start with the Palestinians that are not tied to Hamas or any of the other radical organizations. What do they want? They want the war to end. They have 26,000 casualties, I heard yesterday, people killed and then other injured. Probably everybody in Gaza has somebody that they know that has either been killed or injured severely. The war must end from a innocent Palestinian perspective. They would like a two-state solution. They would like to have some hope in their lives, like you and I would like hope in our life. They would like the American dream. Are they going to get it? I'm not sure. Israel has their legitimate security concerns, and these people have their legitimate hope concerns, as all human beings would have. And somehow stabilize the situation in Gaza so that they can go back to their daily lives. Now, that's just one group. Remember, who they voted into office was Hamas. Now, Hamas does not represent all Palestinians because there's another group of Palestinians that were elected, not by Gazans because they voted this group out. Some people call it Fatah, some people call it the Palestinian Authority, but they generally rule the West Bank. So that's a second group. And then there's Hezbollah up in Lebanon, Ed's going to talk a little bit about that group. But those are the various elements and what they are wanting. But when you come to Hamas, they want it's very specific what Hamas wants. They want to get rid of Israel. So do you see an impossible, how do you negotiate this? If our Secretary of State or CIA director is over there now, if they can come up with this, as Father says, we have to pray as Christians because I'm not sure how this is all going to come together. But so get rid of Israel, free Palestinian state, and a two-state solution, I say, and continue to stay in power, I would say Hamas is one of their objectives. So I'm going to turn it over to Ed now, who is going to talk about the rest of the actors in the situation.
Am I on? Okay. Lots of actors in this situation. Joe talked a lot about the main players, Israel and the Palestinians. I'm going to talk about some of the other regional actors in this drama, I would say, or crisis. I'm going to start with probably the most meddlesome actor in all of this, and that's Iran. Iran's desire out of all of this, and really since they were formed in 1980, is to be the regional power in the Middle East. So if you want to be the regional power, you have to reduce the power of the major powers that are already there. So who's the major power in the Middle East right now? It's Israel. Israel is the strongest country militarily and economically, and their main ally is, of course, the USA. So Iran's major objective to be a regional power is to get the USA out of the Middle East and to tie up Israel with a bunch of proxy forces that they fund and train so that Israel can drain their energy fighting all of these proxy forces. Iran has other enemies in the region besides just the USA and Israel. They are, Islam is their religion, but they're the Shiite brand of Islam. There's a natural, maybe not so much natural, but a long series of hostilities between the Shiite version of Islam and the Sunni version of Islam, which dominates most of the region. Iran also has to be wary of the surrounding countries, which are more Sunni than Shiite. Iran is a theocratic country. They are run by mullahs, who are, they're ayatollahs. Ayatollah Khomeini is currently in charge there. And they're extremely unpopular in this country, very unpopular. They have economic sanctions against them right now. The economy is in shambles. It's basically a dictatorship, and it's run by a theocracy. So what better way to distract their people about all their internal problems than to make enemies of the USA and Israel, so that they have that ready-made boogeyman, as they see it, to distract themselves from all the other problems that are going on in their country. The reason why, again, that they have economic sanctions on their country right now is because of their meddling in other places in the Middle East, and because they're trying to build a nuclear weapon, of which they're very close to right now. So that's why they have economic sanctions on them. They also fund and train, as I mentioned, these proxy forces all throughout the Middle East. I'm going to talk a little bit about them right now. The most powerful one, and the one with the largest reach, is Hezbollah, as Joe briefly mentioned too. They're based primarily in Lebanon and slightly in Syria. And they were formed in the early 1980s. They filled a vacuum that was in the country of Lebanon, which is just north of Israel, when Israel invaded Lebanon to drive the Palestine Liberation Organization out. The PLO was a terrorist organization back then, and they were doing attacks on the north of Israel from Lebanon. So there was an invasion in 1982 by Israel to drive them out. Unfortunately, the Lebanese government was very weak at the time. There was a civil war going on that basically decimated their government. So to fill the vacuum, the Iranians funded and trained Hezbollah to come in, and their purpose was to drive the Israelis out of southern Lebanon and back into Israel. So that's where they were formed. So again, they had two purposes: to drive out Israel in the early 80s out of Lebanon, and second, you may remember the USA, we sent Marines in to Lebanon as a peacekeeping force to make sure that the Israelis, as they were pulling out of their siege of Beirut, to stabilize that area. So that's why we send in Marine peacekeepers. And it was Hezbollah, they're the ones who drove the truck bomb with the suicide bomber that blew up the US Marines camp and killed 241 of our patriots back then. So they have a long history of terrorist attacks. So their goal right now, they don't believe in a two-state solution. They believe in a one-state solution, with the one state being the Palestinians. They want Israel wiped off the map completely. From the river to the sea, you may have heard that saying. They want the entire land, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, to be Palestinian land. They want the Israelis out completely. There's some small-scale hostilities going on right now between Hezbollah and Israel on the northern border. There's rocket launches that are coming daily. Several Israeli soldiers have been killed, several dozen, probably several hundred Hezbollah soldiers have been killed. And this has been going on ever since October 7th and even before. So the nightmare scenario right now would be for a second front in this war to open up. The Israelis are fighting Hamas in the south, and the nightmare scenario would be for the Israelis to have to do a ground invasion of Lebanon in the north against Hezbollah. But that is a possibility, and part of USA policy is to prevent that two-front war going on. A second militia that's causing trouble in the area, funded by Iran, are the Houthis. You may have seen something about them in the news here recently. They're lobbing missiles from their territory in Yemen into the Red Sea against shipping, causing havoc to the Red Sea and the economy there. Brief history of the Houthis. There's a civil war, another one going on in Yemen. The Houthis have the upper hand right now. They are Shiite Muslims, which is why they're supported by Iran. And they're opposed by a lot of the Sunni countries in the area who don't want another Shiite theocracy close to their borders in Yemen. So the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates launched a brutal air campaign to try to stop the Houthis from taking over and winning the civil war. It went on for several years. It was unsuccessful, and it was called off about 2 or 3 years ago. But it's caused great famine in Yemen right now. It's one of the biggest humanitarian disasters in the world right now in this country because of this civil war. So why are the Houthis lobbing missiles then because of this into the Red Sea? Well, again, there's a civil war going on. What better way to recruit people to your cause than to show that you're standing up to Israel and the big bad USA? So it's mostly an internal thing for them. It's a recruitment, it's a way to help win their civil war, and it's a way for them to get more weapons from Iran, more training, and more money. One more proxy force that our friends, unfriends, the Iranians are supporting. There are proxy forces that they have inside Iraq and inside Syria. And these are forces smaller than Hezbollah, smaller than the Houthis, but still large enough to cause problems. And they're funded, trained, again, by Iran. The ones in Iraq, they're the ones who launched the drones against our soldiers in Jordan and killed 3 of our patriots about a week or so ago. So they're there in Iraq. And you might think, don't we have good relationships with Iraq, the USA? Why are they in Iraq? Well, remember, Iraq is primarily Shiite. Iran is Shiite. So even though Iraq is friendly with the United States, they still have good relationships with Iran. So that's why they're allowed to operate in Iraq. The second militia that the Iranians are supporting is in Syria. And their main purpose there is to prop up the Syrian government. Because once again, recurring theme here, there's a civil war going on in Syria. And another humanitarian disaster is going on. But the Iranians are propping up a militia group in there to keep the Assad government in power. And also they're attacking our forces who are in Syria, and they're attacking the Israeli forces and lobbing missiles and other things across the border into Israel. So you can see Iran is the source of a lot of the problems that are there in the Middle East, and they're a big source of tension in that area. Well, let me talk about some of the countries now briefly. The biggest one in the area is the Saudi Arabia. You may have heard that the Saudis came close to having or establishing relationships with Israel. They came very close. The negotiations have been going on for probably 2 or 3 years. They have a ruler named Mohammed bin Salman, MBS for short, and he wants to modernize his country. MBS, he looks to the east and he sees Dubai and Abu Dhabi and these countries that have weaned themselves off oil and are expanding. Their people are getting more prosperous, and they're doing much better economically than the Saudis are. So he wants his country to be like that. And the best way to do that is to have economic ties with Israel, which has the best economy in that region. So they were very close to a deal to establish a relationship between the two countries, Saudi Arabia and Israel. But unfortunately, the attacks of Hamas on October 7th pretty much destroyed any chance of that happening. The Saudis now say that they'll only have either a peace deal or at least have talks or establish economic relations with Israel if there's an irrevocable path to a two-state solution in the area. So it looks like that relationship now is going to be off for the foreseeable future. Three more countries to talk about. Jordan. There was a question about Jordan, and we talked about that very briefly. But Jordan has a sizable Palestinian minority in that country. So even back in 1948 and to the very present, Jordan has always had to do a balancing act between the Palestinian people, who they want to keep happy, and between having peaceable relations with Jordan. So even back in 1948 and 56 and 67, when all the other Arab countries said, we're not talking to Israel, no diplomats, no economic relations, no nothing, in the background, Jordan had secret peace talks with Israel basically since the 1940s. From King Abdullah I, his son King Hussein, and presently King Abdullah II. They've all had a back channel with the Israelis. So Jordan is always kind of in the middle, a balancing act between their own population and trying to have peaceful relations with Israel. Of course, they signed a peace treaty in the early 1990s with Israel, so that they have exchanged ambassadors and they have a good relationship now. But there's still a balancing act for Jordan in this whole opera that we call the Middle East. I talked about Syria briefly. There's a civil war going on right there, and it's a complete, total mess. Now, Syria's long-range goals are always to win back the Golan Heights. That's probably their number one goal, which was lost to them in 1967 in the war with Israel. So almost anything that they do, their ultimate goal is going to be win back the Golan. They also support the Palestinians in their desire to have their own self-determination. But right now, there's a big civil war going on right there, and it involves a lot of the major players in this region. We have troops there, there's Turkish troops there, there's Kurdish people there, ISIS is in there, the Russians are dropping bombs in there, the Turkish are flying airplanes in there, there's a Free Syrian Army that's trying to overthrow the government, so it's complete chaos right now. So until Syria gets its house in order, we're probably not going to see much from the Syrians in this whole crisis, but their goal, and all the countries who lost territory in the 1967 goal, is to win back the territory that was lost. Finally, the Egyptians. They signed the very first peace treaty with Israel in 1979. So they have good relationships with the Israelis. So from their perspective, and I think Joe talked about this briefly, in Gaza, which borders borders Egypt, they don't want a flood of Palestinian refugees flooding into their country right now. So their main goal right now during this crisis is to keep that border secure and make sure that they don't get millions and millions or hundreds of thousands of Palestinians flowing into their country. The attacks by the Houthis in the Red Sea are also causing issues for them because their main source of income is the Suez Canal and ships going through and paying tolls to go through there. And if the shipping is being disrupted by missiles being lobbed in there, it's costing them lots of money. So their perspective is, hey, I don't want all these refugees in my country, and I want this thing to stop so my coffers, my money can keep flowing back in. And lastly, Joe talked about the USA a bit, so I won't go into that. But I think our major goal, one of our major goals, is we don't want to see a regional war break out. We don't want to see Israel attacking Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is lobbing missiles into northern Israel. We don't want to see the Iranians getting into this. We don't want to see it spilling over into Syria. There's lots of things going on. We've bombed the Houthis over the last week, so we'd like for that to stop. We want them to stop their mischief. So there's a lot going on in this area. USA has a lot on our plate right now. We're supporting the Ukrainians. We're keeping an eye on China, because our ally Taiwan is under threat of possible invasion. We're juggling all of this. The last thing the USA wants is to get embroiled in another Middle East war. So those are the perspectives from all the major players in the region.
Yeah, one other thing we want to do before we break for wine and discussion. Diane, could you pass out the...
I think I have a couple questions.
Oh, please. What?
Is this on? Yeah, I'm going to hand out a reading list and watching videos and all. I'd like to recommend in the book section. Okay, turn it back on. The Holy Spirit. All right, there's the Holy. Come, Holy Spirit. All right, there it is. We're going to hand out articles, videos, books, and the books. The first book and the last book are written from a personal perspective. Many of them are more academic. So if you want to understand what had happened to somebody on the ground in Palestine and in Israel, I would recommend the first and the last books.
I think we have some more
The first one is I Shall Not Hate, and the last one is The Lemon Tree. So if you want to read one, start with those two. Okay. Questions? You had a question.
Okay. We've covered what we want to do. We hope you've given you some ideas on what will happen, what could happen. If you've got any ideas on how to solve this situation, please write the State Department. I think they would. But we've got a couple minutes left. Yes, please.
My question is Hezbollah mostly Palestinians?
No. Hezbollah, there are mostly, let me think for a second. They are a Shiite group, yes. I'm trying to think.
Okay, so
make sure I got that right. They're a Shiite group. They really initially had nothing to do with the Palestinians. They were just there to kick Israel out after their invasion of Lebanon in 1982. But of course, since they're sponsored by Iran and wanted to cause trouble in the area, they decided to tack on the Palestinian cause.
So, are the Iranians interested in getting control over Palestine inevitably? And are the Palestinians Shiite?
No, the Palestinians are mostly Sunni.
Mostly
Muslim,
Sunni.
yes.
Okay.
And there are some Christians there also. Actually, I don't know the percentage, but it's a fairly large amount of Christians in that area.
Okay, but the Iranians are the Shiites.
Iranians are the Shiites.
So they're supporting Sunnis, which is odd.
Yes.
Okay.
Hamas is even Sunni,
Okay.
and they're supporting them.
And a question that I'm not sure you'll be able to answer or not is I'm always having a difficult time understanding who is an Arab and who is not. I know that Iran is Persian, but what makes an Arab an Arab? Is it because they're Sunni, or is it something else?
It's an ethnic group, not a religious group.
Yeah.
Arabs are not necessarily tied to the religion, but the religion kind of built up parallel to the ethnic group. But it's the people that live and have gone back in the generations in that part of the world would call themselves Arabs.
And North Africa.
And North Africa. Arabs go into... Except for Persia on the eastern part.
And also Turkey. Or
Lebanon has
Turks aren't Arab either.
Christians, it also has Arabs, yes.
Yeah. And you have the Afghanis who are also not considered Arab. So it's a very complex mixture of people there, yes.
So you earlier had said that Iran wants to be the power. Why? Why can't they be a power within themselves without having to create such crap throughout the area?
I think it's just
a good question.
It's maybe a natural, perhaps, reaction to being a large country in an area, in almost every area of the world, and throughout history, you always have a country that wants to dominate a particular region. Obviously, in North America, it's by far the USA. We have 50 times the power of anybody else. But you have... No, we don't. No, to our credit, we don't do that. But
I think the they're trying to dominate it at the least possible cost. So by supporting these groups that are doing their dirty work, so to speak, they don't have to engage in a highly costly conflict with anyone, although they're playing fire here, as you know. The U.S. is building up a momentum here that who are we going to deal with to stop these attacks, these subordinates or the main player? And that's a dangerous game to play. Dangerous game to play.
With power throughout history, you'll see once a country gains a little bit of power and strength, they want to use that power to dominate its area, to get more power and more money and more riches and everything for their own people. It's just a constant theme throughout history.
There's a question in the back. Yes?
When you talk about Iran and funding and supporting, where does most of their funding come from? Iran?
Historically, it's been oil.
Oil.
Yeah.
Any other countries?
You mean, do any other countries support Iran? I haven't seen, I'm not an intelligence officer, but I haven't seen a whole lot of that happening, and I don't know of any evidence to be able to tell you that.
How many countries have sanctions on Iran? I mean, I know the United States supposedly has them. I understand they're not enforcing them. But are there other countries that are also putting the same sanctions on Iran that we are?
Don't know, John.
I don't know all the countries. I know a large part of Western Europe, I think. Europe is participating in the sanctions. I don't know that a lot of them agree with it for their own reasons. But outside of the USA and Europe, I don't know that there are many other countries that are participating.
We got one question here, maybe one last question. Two questions. Go ahead.
I am the wife of Ed Hobbs, and I wanted to...
I told her to give me a softball question.
and it is going to be softball. We had the opportunity to go to Israel, and we had a room on the Palestine wall.
Yes, in Bethlehem.
Okay, so Ed's comment was when the war started, basically, thank God that we were there before all of this started.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think there was another question, yes.
How likely is that some agreement will be reached having Netanyahu as a prime minister?
Would you go ahead and repeat that one? That's good.
How likely is that some sort of agreement will be reached having Netanyahu as prime minister?
Maybe,
well,
should we ask Father if we can answer this question?
Should we pray for that? Difficult, although he has made it his primary goal is to destroy Hamas. And he has talked about a long-term conflict to make that happen. But eventually, he's got pressures building on him internally to maintain his own power within Israel. So he's got these hostage families that are rising up slowly but surely. But as I have talked about Israel, they're moving harder line as this goes on and on. So it's a toss-up. I don't know the answer to that, and I think our government's probably looking at that and trying to figure out how we can support that and close the end of this conflict. One of the things I wanted to say, usually when we have a forum like this, we go with, well, what can we do about it? You're probably now throwing your hands up and saying, I don't have the slightest idea. But Father started us today with, this is going to require prayers. Because I'm not sure our worldly talents are going to be able to figure this out. But prayer is one of them. Another is, we have people killing each other in the world today. This isn't the only place. But I think as Christians, we have to, this is kind of paralleling the U.S. government, we have to figure out how to cease fire here and stop the killing, however that works. And finally, I think we would want to aid. The amount of aid it's going to take to rebuild Gaza, have you seen? It's like a major city, is going to be billions and billions of dollars. And who's going to put that up. We haven't started talking about that. So those are a couple tagged. You hadn't said anything today.
How can we delete all the terrorist organizations? Not with money and not with prayer. So
what are you suggesting?
delete them.
Delete them. Not with prayer or money. Okay. Well, yeah, go ahead, Ed.
One last thing. If I could make just a brief comment on your great question, whether or not Netanyahu in power would ever be a chance for any peace. I think it'd be difficult based on some of his leanings and principles, but I would say, and I'm a very hopeful person. I like to see the bright side of a lot of issues, and I'm hopeful because out of the 1973 war, we had peace with Egypt that followed. Out of the first Intifada, a few years after that, we were able to have the Oslo Accords. So the first time the PLO recognized Israel, and they were able to set up the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank after that. So there was briefly some hope for peace. So maybe out of this mess, maybe they'll sit back and they'll say, have we seen enough of this killing? Have we seen enough of all this hardship? And maybe the two sides can get together, and maybe it won't lead to a Palestinian state, but maybe it could lead to some sort of cessation of the hostilities, and maybe they can calm down and maybe get back on the road to coexisting together.
Good point. Did you want to close? I think we're running out of time, and we ran out of time.
Over. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Joe and Ed, for doing this. And in the coffee bar, we have wine and cheese, and I think Joe and Ed will be happy to have more conversation. So please join us back there. Thank you.